At 4 p.m. on November 2nd, 2009, 61-year-old Shabtai Kalmanovich left his office on Sergei Mikheev Street in central Moscow. He was on his way to a business meeting, and the next day he had plans to fly to Israel. At 4:30, his Mercedes-Benz, driven by his chauffeur, Peter Tumanov, stopped at a traffic light on the crossroads of Smolenskaya Nabrezhnya and New Arbat Avenue. As they pulled to a halt at the traffic lights, they didn't expect what would come next. A car had been following Shabtai without him or his driver knowing, waiting for them to stop. A hail of bullets from an Armenian K692 submachine gun destroyed the car, inside and out. 24 bullets were fired, 8 of which hit Shabtai, and a few of the rest hit Peter. The shooters fled immediately, with Peter taking chase after them towards the Novodevichy embankment, where he lost control of the car due to his injuries and violently crashed into a tree. Peter managed to survive this attack, thanks to the swift efforts of doctors. Shabtai, however, wouldn't be so lucky, and died on the scene. This wasn't just any random shooting. This was a contract hit on a man who was one of the most famous people involved in European basketball, and a billionaire oligarch. He was known to buy his players lavish gifts, and pay big bonuses at a complete loss. Everyone around Shabtai considered him the salt of the earth. The confusion around this case was who would want this man dead, and why. After doing some research, you'd find out very quickly that Shabtai wasn't nearly as innocent as you'd be led to think. Before we get into some of the theories of who was behind this hit, and to understand why on earth some of the most reputable and feared secret services in the world, or anyone else for that matter, would want to find this Lithuanian basketball mogul in the first place, you first have to understand who Shabtai Kalmanovich is, which is very far from a simple question to answer. If you like this video and you want to see more content like this, like and subscribe. Shabtai was born and raised in Soviet Lithuania, just outside Kaunas. And like many Lithuanians at the time, his family were fully devout Jews. During the Holocaust and the Nazi occupation of Russia, just a couple of years prior, Shabtai's mother, Mina, had spent her days in the 9th Fort just outside Kaunas. This is a Nazi execution site for Jews in the Kovno ghetto, where the Nazis killed roughly 45,000 majority Lithuanian Jews during their occupation of the Western Soviet Union between 1943 and 1944. Luckily for Mina, she wasn't one of them, and she managed to escape captivity in a gas truck. And with the help of a non-Jewish Lithuanian family, she was sheltered from the Nazis and managed to survive the whole Holocaust. She went on to raise Shabtai to a young man who would graduate school in flying colours and attend Kaunas University of Technology to study chemical engineering. After his education, Shabtai spent a brief stint in the Soviet military. During this time, the Zionist Kalmanovich family was going through a hard battle to gain permission from the Soviet government to emigrate to the Soviet Union and move to Israel, where they had automatically gained citizenship thanks to the fact that they were Jewish. At this point, Shabtai was made an offer that he didn't refuse: exit visas from the USSR for his family, in return for his agreement to spy for the KGB once he was in Israel, which, if you don't know, was the notorious secret service of the Soviet Union. This would mark the beginning of a new life for Shabtai, which was covered in secrets and mystery. During his time in Israel, Shabtai's mission was to obtain information about the Netiv organization, which is a part of the Israeli intelligence community. The purpose of this organization was to act by secret means to encourage a Jewish and Zionist awakening in the Soviet Union. Or in other words, the Netiv was all about getting Soviet Jews to emigrate to Israel, and was therefore seen by the KGB as dangerous. Shabtai became increasingly interested and involved in politics, and managed to land himself a job in the Department for New Immigrants of the Israeli Labour Party. His start in the Israeli parliament, called the Knesset, would be as the parliamentary aide to Shmuel Flato Sharon. As a member of the Israeli Labour Party, he had access to the government and the Knesset, gathering information about Israel's domestic politics, and gathering intel and gossip for the KGB from his time spent at the Knesset buffet, which is a feast that the Israeli parliament members would have, and just have a conversation. They may have had small talk and general conversation, but now and again there'd be gossip about the ongoings of parliament and politics in Israel that Shabtai would then relay back to the KGB and the Kremlin. Around this time on duty in Israel, Shabtai was approached by the Israeli intelligence agency called Shin Bet to provide information on the ongoings of the Soviet Union. Shabtai agreed to this request, and apparently provided consistent reliable, however insignificant information about various different classified topics in the USSR. At this time, according to the Daily Telegraph, the CIA believed that Kalmanovich passed to Moscow classified information received by the Mossad about the USA from a double agent spy in the US called Jonathan Pollard, who was eventually sentenced to life in prison in the late 80s. At this time in the mid 80s, this was completely unknown to anyone but Shabtai and his collaborators, and so he moved on with life as normal, and in the business world, doors started to open up thanks to his role in politics. Shabtai's political connections in Israel opened the doors for him to South African authorities, which at the time, during the apartheid era, established a protectorate country in northern South Africa called Bophuthatswana. Shabtai developed a close relationship with the corrupt leader in the new country called Lucas Mangope, who he convinced to let him develop projects in Bophuthatswana with Kalmanovich's new South African-based construction company. Here he built state projects and a casino called Sun City Casino, which would make him his first fortune thanks to his new patron. All while this was happening, he remained a KGB double agent and travelled between Israel, Africa and East Germany to keep all the facets of his life afloat. On one of these trips he met a woman by the name of Anna Momo, perhaps by chance or maybe by design, who he charmed and used to gain access to her husband, Joseph Momo. Joseph was a very high-ranking member of the army of Sierra Leone, which is a tiny country in West Africa which seemingly didn't have much to offer, but what it did have was vast diamond mines and an upcoming election. Shabtai knew this, and it was his time to take advantage. Kalmanovich convinced Momo to run in the next election and took the responsibility of running his election campaign, which would turn out successful in November 1985. Under the influence of Shabtai, Momo gave Kalmanovich the diamond mining rights in Sierra Leone. As a so-called leader, however, Joseph Momo was terrible, and economically, Sierra Leone was left in such a bad state that they couldn't even fuel the country, and was left without electricity for quite some time. This state of affairs didn't affect Shabtai though, who was now concerned with expanding his riches back in Russia, and globally thanks to his new stance as a big player in the global supply of diamonds. In the background, the Israeli government was informed through a Soviet spy being held and interrogated by the CIA in the US of a Soviet spy operating in Israel. This information was very vague, saying that the informant was a Jew who emigrated from Lithuania to Israel. Working with this information, members of the Israeli Department for Countering Soviet Espionage started an operation to track down this spy under the codename Sodom and Gomorrah. They dug through thousands of files in the resident registry of Israel of all the immigrants from Lithuania. Several hundred of them were invited for interviews, and little by little they narrowed their circle of potential suspects down, until finally, after a 1.5 year long investigation, Israeli intelligence agencies came to the conclusion that the only outstanding suspect was a member of their own parliament, Shabtai Kalmanovich. The manhunt for Shabtai began, and it turned out he wasn't too hard to find, because MI5 already had him under arrest in the UK on suspicions of international fraud. He would eventually walk away from this charge a free man, but his first destination after his release was in the custody of Shin Bet. During the interrogation of Shabtai, he openly admitted to being a KGB spy. He's saying that he'd agreed to spy for the KGB under threats and blackmail. He was tried and convicted on charges of espionage in Israel and sentenced to 9 years in prison. But he was released ahead of schedule in a prisoner swap between the Soviet Union and Israel. It would be very tempting to make a biography of the rest of Shabtai's life after his release, and connect facts with fiction, and to make a logical, congruent story. But the truth is that Kalmanovich's life, before, during and after prison, was filled with questions that for the most part, I and others can't answer. Shabtai made it known that he was fearful of his and his family's lives being taken towards the end of his own life. He said in an interview with the Israeli journalist Eli Shvedler, "Yes, I fear for my life and the life of my family, so I moved my wife and children to a safer place, to Lithuania, where I was born." The people who carried out Shabtai's murder were arrested and convicted in 2019, but the people behind it to this day remain a mystery. Many people have tried to come up with theories answering that question, like that the CIA or Mossad had killed him, but the most logical conspiracy was that he was murdered in a Russian mob-related hit. Shabtai did have mafia ties, who may have helped him on his journey to becoming a billionaire. According to some books about the Russian mob, he was fully involved in activities of this global Russian crime group, and his role was to launder huge sums of illegally made money through some of his businesses, like the Sun City Casino and fuel imports into Sierra Leone. I can't prove if these allegations are true, But somewhere along the line, Shabtai must have had some bad dealings with the wrong person, and they made their message clear: cross us and die. As I said earlier, it isn't always crystal clear what happened to Shabtai in his life, and the line between fact and fiction can often be blurred. What is a fact though is the legacy that he's left on European men's and women's basketball, and contrary to other parts of his life, it's a largely positive legacy. In his life after prison, Shabtai became a sports patron and accumulated teams all across Europe, like Zalgiris Kaunas, who he won the EuroLeague with, Spartak Moscow's women's team, who he convinced WNBA legends like Sue Bird and Diana Taurasi to play for. This team also won the EuroLeague, which made him the only manager to win the EuroLeague in both men's and women's competition. Although he'd allegedly done some bad things throughout his life, Shabtai will ultimately be remembered in a positive light by many, and loved for the good things he did in and outside the basketball arena. His legacy remains etched into the history of European basketball, and he definitely won't be forgotten anytime soon.